Funding for this program was provided in part by religious education at Brigham Young University. This address by Dr. Richard Bushman was given at the Sidney B. Sperry Symposium at Brigham Young University on October 28, 2005.
Thank you. I am honored to be here and part of this Sidney Sperry Symposium, going back to this great scholar who really embodied in his life and in his work the best traditions of Latter-day Saint scholarship. Joseph Smith was one who believed there was something holy about learning. He called his first school the School of the Prophets. Sidney Sperry embodied that ideal, and I think we all would benefit from incorporating more of it into our labors. I want to talk tonight of comparison. How does the comparison of one person to another change our perception of both? In the presence of a Muslim acquaintance, I feel quite differently about myself than I do when standing beside a 6-foot, 10-inch basketball player. Each one draws attention to some quality or the absence of a quality in my makeup. And I think this phenomenon extends to historical subjects as well. We see Joseph Smith in a different light if we compare him to William Blake rather than Alexander Campbell. Tonight, I want to compare Joseph Smith to Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln and Joseph's lives brushed by each other at a couple of points in 1844. In a letter dated March 1st, 1840, Abraham Lincoln wrote that Joseph Smith had recently passed through Springfield, Illinois. With tantalizing brevity, Lincoln wrote to his friend John Stuart, "Speed," who was another close friend, says he wrote you what Joseph Smith said about you as he passed here. We will procure the names of some of his people here and send them to you before long. The nature of Joseph's comments on John Stuart can only be surmised. Possibly it was connected to Joseph's visit to Washington, D.C. in 1839, when he was seeking reparations for the Saints' losses in Missouri. He was returning to Nauvoo in the spring when he passed through Springfield. John Stuart, the recipient of Lincoln's letter, was Lincoln's law partner and a member of the Illinois congressional delegation. The Illinois delegation to Congress had gone out of their way to assist Joseph and his legal counselor, Elias Higbee, in making their case in Washington. Likely, Joseph was grateful to Stuart for the help they had received and said so in Springfield. And probably Lincoln was trying to turn this to some political advantage, hoping to win votes among the saints. The letter is a reminder that Joseph Smith and Abraham Lincoln resided in the same state for 5 years before Joseph's death in 1844. In 1840, Lincoln was completing his third term in the state's legislature, where he was the Whig floor leader. Joseph was recovering from the Mormons' expulsion from Missouri and was organizing a new gathering place in Illinois. The prophet was a little over 3 years older than Lincoln, who had been born February 12, 1809. Though they probably never met face to face, the two men illustrate the possibilities for obscure people to reach great heights in the swarming confusion and institutional fluidity of antebellum America. Both were plungers and seekers. Both struggled to understand how God worked his will in human affairs. A comparison of their lives is one way to measure the accomplishments of each of these extraordinary men. Lincoln was the Middle South version and Joseph Smith the Yankee version of backcountry people who transcended their origins and went on to eminence and notoriety on the national scene. They took entirely different paths. Lincoln in law and politics, and Joseph in religion and church leadership. Their religious beliefs stood at the opposite ends of the spectrum too. Lincoln did not believe in the redemption of Jesus Christ, was not known to pray, and attended church haphazardly. His God was an ominous presence who controlled events down to the finest detail, but was beyond human influence. Joseph's God spake to him, forgave him, and led his people like a kind, demanding father with high ambitions for his children. Lincoln's deity was remote and impersonal. Joseph's immanent and involved. But for all the differences, the family histories of these two men follow roughly similar patterns. The first Lincolns migrated from England to Massachusetts in 1637, just 1 year before Robert Smith, Joseph's first American ancestor, landed in Boston. Over the generations, the Lincolns migrated southward, first to New Jersey, then to Pennsylvania and Virginia. Probably because the Smiths stayed put in Topsfield while the Lincolns kept moving. None of the Lincolns achieved the eminence of Joseph's great-grandfather, Samuel Smith, who was town meeting moderator and a representative to the General Court from Topsfield. Lincoln's ancestors were plain farmers and planters, respectable, but of no particular distinction. Despite the spatial separation and the differences in stability and mobility, family patterns converged again with Lincoln's and Joseph's grandfathers. The lives tracked so closely, one is inclined to think they followed a common pattern for this generation of Americans. Lincoln's grandfather, also an Abraham Lincoln, moved west from Virginia to Jefferson County, Kentucky in 1782, 9 years before Joseph's grandfather, Asel, left coastal Massachusetts for Tunbridge, Vermont. The West was the way to go in the 18th century. Abraham's son, Thomas, the future president's father, then moved from farm to farm in Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois, just as Joseph Sr. moved 7 times in 14 years in Vermont and New Hampshire before settling in Manchester, New York. The narrow margin between success and failure in early American farming, combined with the plenitude of land, made frequent migration both a possibility and a necessity for families on the lower edge of the rural economy. Both the Lincolns and the Smiths went through a decline in fortune over their lifetimes. Thomas Lincoln at one time owned 3 farms. When he purchased more land, he paid cash. But his circumstances steadily worsened as he moved from Kentucky to Indiana and then to Illinois. His Kentucky properties turned out to have precarious titles, and he sold them at a loss before moving to Indiana. There he farmed remote frontier lots with little access to markets and grew poorer and poorer. Similarly, Joseph Smith Sr. as a young man owned a substantial farm and a store in Vermont, and then lost both through a failed business venture. Both the Smiths and the Lincolns purchased land on credit late in life. The Lincolns did a little better at the end. They completed payment on half of their Indiana land and sold it for $125 before they made their final move to Illinois in 1830. The Smiths lost their Manchester property when they could not meet the mortgage payment, and thereafter, Lucy and Joseph Sr. were dependent on their children and friends. Both families were caught in the downward economic trend line that ensnared many rural families, contrary to the American myth of ever-increasing prosperity. The ways of living of these two families were basically the same. When the Lincolns moved to Indiana in 1816, the same year the Smiths moved to Palmyra, 8 people crowded into their rough-hewn cabin. A few years later, after contracting for a farm, the Smiths stuffed 10 families into their Manchester log house. Both Lincoln and Joseph cleared land and helped their fathers plant crops. Lincoln followed a horse along the furrow as he plowed. The Smiths probably owned animals, but not necessarily draft animals. They may have reverted to the hoe agriculture of the first settlers, or perhaps borrowed oxen from their neighbors. Neither boy spent much time in school. Lincoln's stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston, who replaced Lincoln's deceased mother, Nancy Hanks, when he was 10, sent the 2 Lincoln children in her own 3 to school. But Lincoln had less than a year of spasmodic instruction as a boy, probably about the same as Joseph. Of the 2, Lincoln was the more avid learner. He could spell down anyone in the school and did all the writing and ciphering for the family while still a teenager. Later stories were told of him taking a book to the fields for reading while the horse rested at the end of a furrow. He did not have access to many books, but he read a few avidly: Weems' Life of Washington, Robinson Crusoe, Pilgrim's Progress, Aesop's Fables, and the Bible. Joseph could have obtained books from the Manchester Lending Library or the Palmyra bookstores, but he had little interest. One early acquaintance said he read a few adventure stories, but he was not bookish. The family studied the Bible, and like Lincoln, Joseph must have spent time with the scriptures. But if Joseph's mother is to be believed, her son did not share Lincoln's appetite for reading. Lincoln began to experiment with language early. While a teenager, he composed a piece of doggerel for his copybook. Abraham Lincoln, his hand and pen, he will be good, but God knows when. When he was about 19, he wrote a humorous account of his sister Sarah's wedding night in biblical language, titling it The Chronicles of Reuben. This and other satirical sallies showed Lincoln's affinity for coarse frontier humor and his interest in words. While living with his father, he spent time in the village store trading quips and developing a reputation as a teller of tales. The scraps of writing revealed a wish to hold on to those words and make them work better. He was far ahead of Joseph, who is not known to have written a word until he was in his 20s. His wife said when she married him at age 21, he could not compose a decent letter. To the end of his life, he made spelling errors. Joseph's mind turned more to religious questions and to the supernatural. Before he was 13, he was questioning the state of his soul and asking how he could find forgiveness. The babble of preaching in the burned-over district confused him and prevented him from enjoying stable religion. He did not turn to books for his answers, but to spiritual inquiry and prayer. Lincoln probably went to church with Thomas Lincoln, who joined the Pigeon Creek Baptist Church when Lincoln was 14, the very age when Joseph's questioning was reaching a crisis. But in Lincoln's case, the father's religion did not result in conversion or even faith. He did not ask God for help or come to any resolution in his soul. Sarah Bush Lincoln said that Abraham had no particular religion, didn't think of that question at that time. If he ever did, he never talked about it. He relied on his own reasoning and even tried to close down his religious emotions. Joseph, meanwhile, was awash in religious anxieties that he quieted through his prayers. Lincoln lived in an environment as electric with superstition and the supernatural as Joseph's, but he never took to folk magic. Joseph found a seer stone when he was 16 or 17, which he used to find lost objects and help his father on treasure quests. Lincoln's rationality raised a wall against the supernatural searches of his neighbors. He never took an interest in the magical or yearned to get in touch with unseen powers. His adolescent mind went to books, while Joseph's was caught up in visions and seer stones. Lincoln's reason kept the supernatural at bay. His mind was not furnished with the treasure lore that awakened Joseph to the play of supernatural forces and the possibility of unseen worlds. And yet religion did seep into Lincoln's mind. He wrote the words of an Isaac Watts hymn into his copybook, and as a boy he would parody Sunday's sermon by repeating them word for word, as his brother said, on a stump or a log when home after service, mimicking the style and tone of the old Baptist preachers. Protestant language and thus Protestant thought shaped his fundamental categories of understanding. Through regular attendance at his father's and mother's Baptist church, Lincoln may have had more knowledge of religion than Joseph, whose parents did not regularly attend church. When his mother Lucy joined the Presbyterians, Joseph Jr. stayed home with his father. Joseph possessed religious sensibilities that Lincoln lacked, but had less exposure to doctrine and Christian culture. Until he was 22, Lincoln gave few signs of unusual ambition or particular genius. At age 17, he got a job helping an Ohio ferryman 16 miles from his father's Spencer County, Indiana farm. 2 years later, Lincoln constructed a flatboat with a friend and floated a load of farm produce down the Ohio and Mississippi to New Orleans, where he experienced the excitement of the nation's most cosmopolitan city. But he returned only to sink once more into the dull routine of farm work and odd jobs. One biographer, Benjamin Thomas, says of this period, Lincoln seemed to be drifting into the same unimaginative life of a pioneer farmer or hired hand that had become the lot of his father and those about him. Later, Lincoln called himself at this period a piece of floating driftwood. Lincoln's one daring step was to break free from his father's household. When after a hard winter, Thomas Lincoln moved once more, this time to Coles County, Illinois, Abraham was not in the party. Instead, he made plans for another flatboat excursion to New Orleans with two friends. He got as far as St. Louis and then returned to New Salem, a village on the Sangamon River the boatmen had passed on their way downstream. Lincoln had been offered a job as a storekeeper, and on reflection considered this a better opportunity than the New Orleans voyage. In New Salem in 1831, Lincoln's ambition kicked in. He was age 22, and for the next 3 years, he turned himself into a politician headed for Whig Party leadership and eventually the presidency. He began studying grammar and mathematics to improve his writing and thinking. His skill in frontier rhetoric and competence in storekeeping won the admiration of locals who elected him captain of the militia. He was chosen postmaster, took up surveying, and began reading law. Gaining confidence and finding politics fascinating, he ran for the state legislature in 1832. Missed out on that election, but then succeeded in 1834. In 3 short years, from age 22 to 25, he suddenly bloomed. A man who knew him well said Lincoln had a strong conviction that he was born for better things than seemed likely or even possible. That self-vision took over during these 3 years in New Salem. Joseph's late adolescence had a different character than Lincoln's, but the years from age 22 to 25 were also his time of blossoming. Until 1827, when he turned 22, Joseph had been a seeker who had done nothing. God in Christ had appeared to him. He'd been visited by an angel. The grand mission to translate had been declared to him, and he was ready. But he was all anticipation rather than accomplishment. He was the passive recipient of visions. He may even have been uncertain and confused about when he was to begin and how he was to go about his work. How was he, a barely literate boy, to translate? It must have seemed like a mysterious and forbidding task. Then, as he turned 22, his work began. He obtained the plates and the interpreters, and with Emmett at first and then Martin Harris began to dictate. After the loss of the first manuscript, he wrote the rebuke received from the Lord, the first of his written revelations, later to constitute the Book of Commandments. For a year and a half, from the winter of 1828 to the summer of 1829, words poured from him in a flood. The bulk of the Book of Mormon was translated in 3 months. Over 500 pages of sermons, prophecies, visions, wars, miracles, journeys, admonitions. The young man who was not known for sure to have read a book or preached a sermon produced a book full of sermons and theological declarations. In March 1830, 3 months after his 24th birthday, the Book of Mormon was published. A few weeks later, he organized a church with himself as first elder. That summer, he received the revelation of Moses that commenced the revision of the Bible. In the fall, he dispatched missionaries to locate the site of the New Jerusalem, where the city of Zion was to be built in preparation for the Lord's second coming. When he arrived in Kirtland, a month after his 25th birthday, he could present himself as Joseph the prophet with a string of accomplishments to support the claim. The same 3 years in the life cycle, from 22 to 25, launched the careers that would bring Lincoln and Joseph to their eminent positions in the political and religious history of the nation. Lives that had been obscure, private, and in Lincoln's case, unpromising, suddenly entered on the public scene. James Gordon Bennett, the bustling New York reporter who visited Palmyra in 1831, could write a report on Joseph that began, "You have heard of Mormonism, who has not?" This was the time of emergence for both men. But there the similarities cease. From then on, the shape and character of their careers differ drastically. Lincoln began his ascent at the bottom, as the American myth of personal progress required. He developed skills as a storekeeper, public speaker, surveyor, and lawyer, and then ran for office. He failed the first time, but did not give up. On the next try, he was elected. He ascended gradually, as would be expected for one climbing a tall peak. Not so with Joseph. He burst onto the public scene with his masterpiece. The Book of Mormon, his greatest literary creation, was also his first written work. He made no preparations, did not attend school, did not experiment with smaller writings, did not read in preparation. Under inspiration, he precipitously dictated a 584-page book. Then, not pausing, went on to the Book of Moses and the heaven-daring task of revising the Bible. Rather than ascending gradually, taking a few small steps at first, Joseph made a series of grand gestures, including the organization of a new church, which he said was the one true church among all the churches of the earth. The curve of his achievement, rather than rising gradually, ascended almost vertically in the first 3 years, making him a prophet and seer from the beginning, rather than as accumulation over time. Instead of working his way up, Joseph catapulted into eminence. The spirit and motive of the two emergences had a different cast too. Lincoln was driven by ambition, coupled with a thrilling sense of his own powers. In New Salem, he began to glimpse his destiny and yearned to fulfill it. He took steps to acquire the skills, put himself forward for public office, and sought out promising friendships. He was ambitious in the best sense of the word, aggressively carving the path he wished to follow. Joseph may have been ambitious, but that is not the impression left in his writings. He sought forgiveness and understanding, but did not seek office or elevation. These came to him in the sense they were thrust upon him. Instead of being the product of diligence, talent, and calculation, Joseph's work was given to him. He sought help from God, but always received more than he bargained for. Asking at age 17 if his sins were forgiven, he was told he was to translate the Book of Mormon. After learning to look in a seer stone for lost objects, he was given a Urim and Thummim to translate Reformed Egyptian. He asked which church was right and was told to organize a new church. The work kept inflating beyond his expectations. Everything he took up exceeded his initial projection. Rather than being driven by personal ambition, he seemed to work under command. While taking divergent paths, Joseph and Lincoln passed through the same darkling plain in early life. They both struggled with skepticism about the scriptures and the Christian religion. Lincoln's encounter is more fully documented and had a more lasting effect, but there is good evidence that Joseph also had a bout with what was then called infidelity. The term referred to a conglomerate of beliefs put forward by Thomas Paine in The Age of Reason, Ethan Allen in Reason, the Only Oracle of Man, David Hume on Miracles, C.F. Volney, Ruins of Civilization, and other works in that vein. The upshot of this complex body of writings was to throw the authenticity of the scriptures into question and to undermine the belief in Jesus as the Son of God and Savior of mankind. Some writers verged on atheism. More ended up with differing varieties of deism that found God in nature rather than in the Bible. Both Lincoln and Joseph explored these ideas in informal discussion societies modeled roughly after Benjamin Franklin's Junto a century earlier. All around the country, ambitious young men gathered to read and talk with the aim of improving themselves. In these informal gatherings, they could try out ideas too scandalous for discussion in church or family. These small circles had been forming at various levels of society throughout the 18th century, and by the 1820s sprang up in little villages like Palmyra and New Salem, among people with as little education as Joseph Smith and Abraham Lincoln. In Joseph's case, local printers, men in touch with wider currents of thought, formed a juvenile debating club, which gathered in the Red Schoolhouse on Durfee Street to, as one man put it, to solve some portentous questions of moral or political ethics. In Lincoln's New Salem, intellectually oriented young professionals in the making got together to read their writings to each other. Among his friends, Lincoln was able to express doubts that probably had been forming since attending church with Thomas Lincoln's Pigeon Creek Baptist. How much he read of infidel writings is not known, but he came to question the inspiration of the Bible and to reject the efficacy of Christ's redemption, just as if he had absorbed Thomas Paine. At the end of his wrestle with skepticism, however, Lincoln did not come out in the glowing sunshine of Paine's deism. Paine doubted the Bible, but had infinite faith in nature, which he thought bore constant witness to the benevolence and might of the Creator. The evidence of God's handiwork were everywhere, Paine thought, and it was the privilege and joy of mankind to contemplate nature's wonders. Lincoln found in nature only determinism, the iron law of necessary causes. The God that remained for him after the Bible, as one commentator has put it, was the Calvinist God of predestination and indifference to human wishes without a redeeming Christ or a comforting Holy Spirit. Lincoln fused the scientific doctrine of necessity, that everything, even human thought, was caused and therefore predetermined, with a Calvinist principle of predestination. Lincoln's God was less the creator of glorious nature than a distant providence that ruled and determined all human affairs without visible concern for human happiness or will. Joseph passed through the rigors of skepticism without being scarred or frightened. He may have first encountered infidelity at the Palmyra Debating Society. Oliver Cowdery spoke of a time when Joseph questioned the existence of God. The sure evidence that he had encountered skepticism was the passage in his 1832 history about nature testifying to God's existence. The sun, the moon, the stars, the earth, and man walking forth upon the face of the earth in majesty. All these bear testimony and bespeak an omnipotent and omnipresent power, so Joseph wrote. The sentiments are pure deism and would have been recognized by anyone who had stood up to infidelity as Lincoln and Joseph did. Later, the men in Zion's camp were surprised at how well Joseph grasped the case for skepticism. One Sunday, when the marchers were trying to disguise their Mormon identity before a crowd of curious onlookers, Joseph spoke for an hour, pretending to be, as George A. Smith put it, a liberal free thinker. George Smith wrote that those present remarked that he was one of the greatest reasoners they had ever heard. But Joseph quickly passed beyond deism, overcome by his marvelous experience, as he called it in the 1832 history. The presence of heavenly angels left no room for further doubt, but the skeptical arguments remained in the background of his mind. The Constitution of the Church, written soon after the organization, named the overcoming doubts about the Bible as one purpose of Joseph's revelations. The Book of Mormon, the Revelation said, proved to the world that the Holy Scriptures are true and that God inspires men and calls them to his holy work. Lincoln thus entered adult life with a belief in God as a controlling will, standing over all existence, determining every outcome, but showing no empathy or compassion. Joseph, on the other hand, had experienced the presence of a speaking God. Joseph's God mingled his will with human exertion, had plans for the human race, and responded to questions and desires. He punished and rewarded, blessed and withheld, rebuked and revealed. Joseph's God was as immanent in human affairs as any God in 19th century religion. Lincoln's idea for America, not surprisingly, was empty of religious purpose. He did not believe the nation could please the withdrawn Calvinist being who ruled everything. God did not instruct the nation in how to conduct itself. Although he controlled everything that transpired, he did not necessarily manifest himself in any government, house of worship, religious creed, body of doctrine, or righteous work. He was above all human striving and belief. A righteous God, he brought the nation to righteousness in his own way, in his own time. Lincoln's chief hope for the nation was to establish a justice that would allow human beings to thrive in purely worldly terms. He embraced the Whig Party's hopes for a prosperous, industrious people who would labor and be rewarded for their work. He wanted to fashion an economy where workers would not be drawn into the downward spiral of poverty that had trapped Thomas Lincoln. He believed the development of the market economy would enable an individual to rise from hired laborer to independent worker to employer on a farm or in a factory or in a shop. The happiness of extracting oneself from the mire of poverty was the best that Lincoln hoped for Americans. He hated slavery for denying captive workers the benefits of their own labor. Unrequited toil, his words, was the sin of slavery. He feared that certain forms of factory work would enslave white laborers in the same injustice. He had Alexander Hamilton's vision of a people fulfilling themselves through creative and rewarded labor. A properly functioning, justly organized market economy was for Lincoln the essence of the good society. Joseph's revelations passed judgment on the market economy and found it wanting. One revelation said quite radically that men were to be equal in earthly property, that they may be equal in heavenly goods. The world lay in sin because of gross economic inequality. One revelation proposed a system of consecrating property and redistributing it to assure work and the elimination of poverty. But these egalitarian principles were not ones Joseph would die for. He attempted a thorough consecration of property in Jackson County in 1831 through 1833, partially in Far West in 1838, and not at all in Nauvoo after its settlement in 1839. Equality of property was an ideal rather than a functioning necessity for Joseph. If the poor could be cared for through capitalist enterprise, no objections would be raised. In Nauvoo, he encouraged the men of property to set up mills to employ the poor and said nothing about redistributing the profits. His main concern was to provide employment in a comfortable life for all his people. Joseph's greater concern was for the saints' spiritual education. He once wrote that nothing could prevent divine knowledge from pouring from heaven on the heads of the Latter-day Saints. In his plot for the original Society of Zion, he placed 24 temples at the center, saying nothing about shops, factories, or theaters. The dominant structure in Nauvoo was its huge temple, far out of proportion to the means of the people. Joseph put spiritual instruction above all other values in his city, believing that virtue would flow from this knowledge. By the end of his life, he hoped to cover the country with such cities and temples. His vision of America was a nation of Zion cities, prosperous to be sure, but righteous and divinely instructed. He wanted his people to grow in divine intelligence by contemplating the works of God in Scripture and reading from all good books on every possible topic. The young man who had never read a book before age 20 and had minimal schooling made education and divine instruction the premier value of his Zion cities. Intelligence was his supreme wish rather than Lincoln's economic opportunities. Of the two men, Joseph seems to be the happy warrior, filled with bright hopes and spiritual desires, and Lincoln, the glum materialist who had no other dream than to let Americans get rich. At first glance, it appears that Lincoln thought it was hopeless to strive for God because God was out of their reach. But this abbreviated caricature does not do him justice, nor is it right to think of Joseph as invariably optimistic and cheerful. Lincoln's spiritual depths were plumbed in the tragedy of the Civil War, and after the Missouri expulsion, a despairing and angry Joseph wondered if God had failed him. In Lincoln's thinking, the Civil War was proof of God's implacability. Why was the war prolonged while hundreds of thousands died? Justice was clearly on the side of the North. Surely, a fight against slavery was a battle for the good. He did believe it was God's will the government of the people, by the people, and for the people should be established on the earth, and that slavery should end. Why then did the North not overcome the South without all the bloodshed? Lincoln could only conclude that the ways of the Almighty were incomprehensible to him. God clearly willed the war to go on, however bloody, though Lincoln could not fathom why. The Almighty has his own purposes, he wrote. Lincoln bowed before this divine opacity in humble incomprehension. He did not call down the wrath of God on the sinning slave owners, self-righteously proclaiming God was a Yankee. He did not see the Redeemer in the fires of 100 circling northern camps. Lincoln's God did not take sides. He was everywhere, north and south. Out of Lincoln's bafflement came not wrath or vindictiveness, but compassion. Because it was God that determined all, no one could judge his enemy or himself. All were helpless before the divine might, with malice toward none, with charity for all. He wrote in his second inaugural in 1865, "Let us bind up the nation's wounds." The distance of God reduced Lincoln to utter humility, stripping away all judgment and wish for retribution. In the end, his belief in a distant God ennobled the president. It made him capable, Job-like, to bear the sorrows of the nation and submit to the conundrums of human suffering. Lincoln's faith in the controlling power of divine providence made him look for the hand of God everywhere in the events of history and even in his own actions. In the course of the war, he came to believe that he himself had become an instrument of God. He told a group of visiting clergymen that it was his earnest desire to know the will of providence on freeing the slaves. "If I can but learn what his will is, I will do it," he assured them. In the extremities of the nation's trial, he longed for personal revelation that would enable him to see clearly, and he believed it came. One associate remembers Lincoln saying that the Almighty does make use of human agencies and directly intervenes in human affairs is one of the plainest statements of the Bible. I have had so many evidences of his direction, so many instances when I've been controlled by some other power than my own will, that I cannot doubt that his power comes from above. I frequently see my way clear to a decision which I am conscious that I have no sufficient facts upon which to found it, but I cannot recall one instance in which I have followed my own judgment, founded upon such a decision, where the results were unsatisfactory. I am satisfied that when the Almighty wants me to do or not to do a particular thing, he finds a way of letting me know it. Toward the end, he relied more and more on the inner light, an occasional presentiment, as he called it, and possibly his own dreams. In a biblical culture, the logic of revelation overcame his sense of God's indifference to human wishes. As one scholar has said, under the duress of war, Lincoln came to think of himself as a latter-day Moses, learning God's will on the presidential mountain and bringing it down to the people. I should be the veriest shallow and self-conceited blockhead upon the footstool of the earth, Lincoln said to Noah Brooks on Election Day in 1864. If my discharge of the duties which are put upon me in this place, I should hope to get along without the wisdom which comes from God and not from men. Revelation did not clarify God's purposes for Lincoln. The prolonged bloody war still baffled him, but he believed that Providence had made the president himself an instrument of its will. Joseph's God, though immanent and communicative from the start, was no less perplexing. After directing the saints to build Zion, after requiring them to sacrifice so much, why did God suffer their persecutors to overwhelm them? Rather than making defeats easier to bear, the nurturing God made them all the more perplexing. Why should the saints' enemies be allowed to frustrate God's own work? Having confidence that God was on their side made the triumph of their enemies all the more confusing. John Corrill, an early Kirtland convert and leading figure in Missouri, left the church in 1839 and explained to Joseph exactly why. Everything he attempted had failed. Wherever the saints had founded a city, under God's direction, they had been attacked and expelled. When nothing went right, how could one say God was in it? In his public letters, Joseph offered constant reassurance to the saints. They were not abandoned. Their cause was just. God would soon come to their aid. But in his private contemplations, Joseph brought the same questions to his prayers. Why had they been driven? Why was Joseph separated from his family? Where is thy pavilion, O God? The answer was as difficult as Lincoln's. It is all for thy experience, my son, Joseph was told. Remember that I, the Lord, descended below all things too. Are your sufferings greater than mine? The answer to Joseph was, you must bear it. I did, and so must you. In the end, you will see it all had a purpose in giving you experience. Lincoln's ponderings led him to reflect on God's imponderable will. Joseph's revelations told him life was an inescapable trial that brought suffering even to Christ. Events drove both men into the heart of darkness where the right does not prevail and God absents himself. Both tried to affirm that God was present, though invisible and inexplicable. Neither was embittered by the miseries they saw. Lincoln advocated charity toward all. Joseph wrote after 5 months in prison that the way of the priesthood, despite the evils wrought by men, was persuasion, love, and long-suffering. He knew power corrupted nearly everyone, including the men who had beaten and driven his people. But the answer was not power against power, but gentleness, meekness, and love unfeigned. Joseph died in 1844, just as Lincoln, somewhat falteringly, came on the national scene. He was elected to Congress in 1846, where he made no impression. He was an unsuccessful candidate for the U.S. Senate in 1854 and ran again unsuccessfully against Stephen Douglas in 1858. Though defeated both times, he was on hand to take the leadership of the Republican Party when it emerged after 1856. He was 51 when elected president. Joseph had died at 38, the age at which Lincoln first entered the House of Representatives. The prophet's accomplishments were compressed into 16 years from the time he began to translate the Book of Mormon in 1828 until his murder in 1844. No one would remember Lincoln today if he had died at 38. They both died significantly. Neither passed from this life by natural causes. Their deaths by assassins' bullets were a culmination, a punctuation mark on their lives and accomplishments. Lincoln died for breaching the South's slave system, Joseph for claiming divine authority. Their deaths were seen as sacrifices for the causes they lived for, testaments of their respective works. The form of their deaths hallowed the memory of their lives. Lincoln was remembered for emancipating the slaves and saving the Union, but that was not his only legacy to the nation. He had defined the core of American values as the individual's right to pursue wealth. The evil of slavery was its denial of the fruits of labor to the people who'd labored. Lincoln's aim was to create an economy in which Thomas Lincoln could rise from poverty on his farm, or an enterprising entrepreneur could accumulate goods through a little business, as Lincoln himself had risen through law and politics. That form of economic justice was the highest ideal Lincoln entertained for the United States. His dreams for America were almost solely economic. We fought the war, he said in 1861, to preserve a government whose leading object is to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to clear the paths of laudable pursuit for all, to afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life. His ideals led to industrialization, corporations, consumerism, and unfettered individual ambition. Without directly advocating these outcomes, they were the result of his dream of equality. His Republican Party sponsored the industrialization of America. Lincoln's distant God required nothing particular of the nation. Lincoln could imagine nothing more transcendent than an equal opportunity for everyone to get ahead. For Lincoln, writes Gabor Borat, the foremost scholar of Lincoln's economic thought, unobstructed upward mobility was the most important ideal America strove for. Joseph's more complex view of human destiny was far more contentious. He interfered too much in human affairs, disaffected Mormons complained. He insisted on brotherhood and service and the consecration of properties to the greater good, in direct contradiction to American individualism. Rather than freeing people from constraints, Joseph bound them together. Joseph's aim was Zion, an exalted society based on faith and common devotion to a great cause. He wanted his bruised father to become a priest of God and enjoy an inheritance in the promised land. The factories and rail lines of Lincoln's postbellum America would have impressed Joseph only insofar as they facilitated the gathering to Zion and the creation of an equitable society. Lincoln took human nature as he found it, self-interested, ambitious, energetic, and tried to create a social order in which this natural man could enjoy his just deserts. Joseph built institutions to instruct men spiritually, to put them in touch with God, and to help them find the divine potential within themselves. The temple, not the marketplace, was the pivotal institution of his cities. With all this in mind, how does comparison with Abraham Lincoln, contribute to a greater appreciation of Joseph Smith's doctrinal contributions, the theme of the symposium this year? In the first place, we see that Joseph Smith's plan for the city of Zion was more than an eccentric's hopes for fulfilling biblical prophecy. They were also an entry in a contest over the future of the United States. They addressed the question of what can be expected of this nation, and beyond that, what were the possibilities for human society. That the wisest and deepest of our presidents could summon only a materialist hope for this country is brought into sharp relief when compared with the Mormon prophets' plans for a society dedicated to divine intelligence and the end of poverty and inequality. Only when a spiritual view of the future is brought before us do we recognize the limitations of materialist aspirations. Joseph Smith forces us to ask, is rising in the world enough? Desirable as equal opportunity may be, is there nothing higher or better to strive for than prosperity? Secondly, the comparison with Lincoln, who is widely honored for his theological profundity, shows us a prophet who plumbed the mysteries of human existence too. Both men suffered profoundly. Both saw the cause to which they had given their lives brought into jeopardy. Both wondered why God hid when cruelty prevailed. Like Lincoln, Joseph reached his spiritual high point when he was lowest. There is theological grandeur in the King Follett discourse, but there is theological nobility in Joseph's letters from Liberty Prison. The two men were opposites in the same. They both rose from the lowest levels of American society. The circumstances of their lives plunged both into existence's darkest mysteries. Both retained a belief that however dark the way, God rules over all. In the end, Lincoln even saw the need for personal revelation. But their beliefs about God and his expectations for humankind divided Joseph and Lincoln fundamentally. One believed God left people to fend for themselves. The other believed that God wanted his children to live together in love, to help each other become gods. Lincoln's program resulted in factories, merchandise marts, and a population of workers, Joseph's in temples, cities, and a Zion people. Lincoln's regard for individual rights led him to plow around the hard, wet, heavy Mormon log rather than split, burn, or move it. He did not raise his voice against the Mormons when public animosity was rising dangerously. He looked on with his characteristic compassion, generous, respectful, and uncomprehending. He could find no basis in his religion to do more than leave the Mormons alone, but that was all they wanted. While Lincoln's Republicans promoted industrialization, Joseph's Mormons organized Zion cities in the desolation of the Great Basin as monuments to the vision of their founding prophet. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
For more information on this program, visit our website at byubroadcasting.org. This address by Dr. Richard Bushman was given at the Sidney B. Sperry Symposium at Brigham Young University on October 28, 2005.